When you think of the new covenant, it's pretty common to think that it has everything to do with the New Testament. And if it has everything to do with the New Testament, then it shouldn't have anything to do with the Old Testament, right? Well, in this video, I want to show you guys something that I've never heard of before. And this is probably going to be something that's new to you guys as well. So first, we're going to take a look at this new covenant prophecy in Jeremiah 31. And after we do that, we're going to see its fulfillment in the Most High's word. Jeremiah 31, verse 31. Behold, the days come, saith Yahuwah, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers, in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was an husband unto them, saith Yahuwah. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith Yahuwah. I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know Yahuwah, for they shall all know me from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith Yahuwah. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. So now that we've seen this new covenant prophecy in the Old Testament, let's take a look at the takeaways from the prophecy. Number one, Yahuwah said that he would make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. That's not the same as the covenant that he made with Israel back in Egypt. Number two, Yahuwah would put the law in their hearts. Number three, the Most High would be their Elohim. They would be his people. Number four, everyone would know about the Most High, so you wouldn't have to teach people to know him. Number five, Yahuwah would forgive and forget his people's sins. So those are the 5 takeaways from that Jeremiah 31 New Covenant prophecy. And now that we've seen those takeaways, let's take a look at how the New Testament interprets Jeremiah 31. Hebrews 8, verse 6. But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. Hebrews is saying that Jesus is the mediator of the new covenant. Now let's keep reading. Verse 8. For finding fault with them, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continue not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. So it's reading just like Jeremiah 31. Verse 10. For this is a covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts. And I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. And they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me from the least to the greatest. So in here, it's almost like a copy and paste from that Jeremiah 31 prophecy. But let's keep reading. Verse 12. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. In that he saith, a new covenant. He hath made the first old. Now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. In the New Testament, the new covenant is tied in with Jesus, as you can see in this passage. Clearly, if you believe in the New Testament, you believe that the new covenant was instituted in the New Testament. So right now we have two options. We can accept what the New Testament says without doing any more studying, or we can do what the New Testament tells people who believe in it to do in 1 Thessalonians 5:21. And that's to prove all things, hold fast that which is good. So if you've seen any of my other videos, you already know that we're going to choose the second option. To start to see a fulfillment of this new covenant prophecy, we're going to begin reading in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 32 and verse 36. That's where we're going to start off. It says, "And now therefore, thus saith Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel, concerning this city whereof ye say, it shall be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon, by the sword and by the famine and by the pestilence." Throughout the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah the prophet said that Judah would go into captivity at the hands of the Babylonians. And that's exactly what Jeremiah is describing here. Judah would go into captivity and would be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon. So now let's keep reading. Verse 37. "Behold, I will gather them out of all countries, whither I have driven them in mine anger, and in my fury, and in great wrath. And I will bring them again unto this place, and I will cause them to dwell safely." When you first take a look at this prophecy, it may look like it's talking about the future, but it's actually not. A simple word search proves that verse 37 is talking about the Most High delivering his people out of the Babylonian captivity. This is something that happened a long time ago, not anything that will happen in the future. And just to show you guys this, we're going to actually stay in the book of Jeremiah, but we're going to go to chapter 29 to see that verse 37 is not a future prophecy. This actually already happened. Jeremiah 29 and verse 10. "For thus saith Yahuwah, that after 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you in causing you to return to this place." So right here, it's talking about after the 70 years of the ancient Babylonian captivity, the Most High was going to allow his people to return back to their land. This already happened. There was a 70-year Babylonian captivity, and then he allowed his people to return back to their land. So we know this is not future. Verse 11, "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith Yahuwah, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. Then shall ye call upon me, and ye shall go and pray unto me, and I will hearken unto you. And ye shall seek me and find me, when ye shall search for me with all your heart. And I will be found of you, saith Yahuwah. And I will turn away your captivity, and I will gather you from all the nations and from all the places whither I have driven you, saith Yahuwah. And I will bring you again into the place whence I caused you to be carried away captive." So like we just read, Israel was in the Babylonian captivity for 70 years. And after those 70 years, Yahuwah said he would deliver them from that captivity. Now, notice this. He says basically the same thing that he just said in Jeremiah 32. And now you can see both of the scriptures together right here. And when you take a look at that, you can see that both of them actually say that Yahuwah would gather his people from all the nations and countries where he sent them into captivity. Then he was going to bring them back into their own land. So when we go back into Jeremiah 32 verse 37, I just wanted to show you that that is not talking about something that will happen in the future. It has already happened. After the Babylonian captivity, the Most High gathered his people and brought them back into their land. Both of these scriptures are actually talking about the deliverance from the Babylonian captivity. And it's key to understand this because Jeremiah 32, the context of it is talking about the deliverance of the Babylonian captivity. Right now, we're going to stay in the book of Jeremiah 32, but we're going to skip down to verse 41. And all we're doing is just understanding what the context of Jeremiah 32 is actually talking about. So when we see where it talks about the covenant, we know what time that is actually referring to. So let's stay in Jeremiah 32 and go to verse 41. It says, "Yeah, I will rejoice over them to do them good, and I will plant them in this land, assuredly with my whole heart and with my whole soul." So Yahuwah is talking about planting his people in their land again. Verse 42, "Thus saith Yahuwah, like as I have brought all this great evil upon this people, so will I bring upon them all the good that I have promised them." This is basically like what we were reading before. After Yahuwah put his people in the Babylonian captivity, he would actually take them out of that and put them back in their land. Right here it says plant them in their land, and he says he's going to bring all the good that he promised them. This also, like I was saying, it refers to the Babylonian captivity. And we can actually go back into Jeremiah 24 and see that it's saying that. So now we're going to go into Jeremiah 24 and actually confirm that this is still talking about the Babylonian captivity and that it's not talking about something that will happen in the future. Jeremiah 24 and verse 4 says, "Again, the word of Yahuwah came unto me, saying, Thus saith Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel, like these good figs, so will I acknowledge them that are carried away captive of Judah, whom I have sent out of this place into the land of the Chaldeans for their good." This is referring to the ancient Babylonian captivity. The land of the Chaldeans is ancient Babylon. So he says he sent them from Judah into that Babylonian captivity. Verse 6 says, "For I will set mine eyes upon them for good, and I will bring them again to this land, and I will build them and not pull them down, and I will plant them and not pluck them up." And here we know for sure this is talking about the ancient Babylonian captivity that happened already. But it uses similar words that we just read in Jeremiah 32. For example, it talks about planting them in their land. So both of those passages say that. It also talks about bringing good upon them, because in Jeremiah 32:42 it says, "I will bring upon them all the good that I have promised them." In Jeremiah 24 verse 6 it says, "For I will set mine eyes upon them for good, and I will bring them again to this land." So they're all talking about the same thing. The Most High is going to have favor, or he did already have favor upon his people when he brought them out of the Babylonian captivity. So now that we know that Jeremiah 32 is just talking about the deliverance from the Babylonian captivity and not anything that's going to happen in the future, let's continue reading it to see something interesting. We're going to go to Jeremiah 32 and verse 38. It says, "And they shall be my people, and I will be their Elohim, and I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever, for the good of them and of their children after them." Verse 40, "And I will make an everlasting covenant with them, that I will not turn away from them to do them good, but I will put my fear in their hearts, that they shall not depart from me. So Yahuwah is talking about making an everlasting covenant with his people in this scripture. And this sounds familiar to me. This sounds like Jeremiah 31 verse 31, where it talks about the new covenant that Yahuwah would make with his people. In both of these scriptures, you can see that the Most High is making a covenant with his people. One calls the covenant a new covenant, one calls it an everlasting covenant. But remember, the everlasting covenant in Jeremiah 32 is centered around the deliverance from the Babylonian captivity, because that's what the context is talking about. Before this verse in Jeremiah 32:40, we read that, the Most High was gonna bring his people back into their land out of the Babylonian captivity. And then after this verse, we saw that still the context is talking about the same thing. It's talking about something that already happened in the past and not in the future. So we actually see in Jeremiah 32 verse 40 that it uses the word everlasting to describe this covenant. But don't get caught up on that, and here's why. Jeremiah 50, when you read that, it actually talks about Yahuwah's people getting an everlasting covenant also. But the key thing here is it talks about them getting an everlasting covenant right after they come out of the Babylonian captivity. And let's read that. Let's go to Jeremiah chapter 50 and let's start at verse 1. It says, "The word that Yahuwah spake against Babylon and against the land of the Chaldeans by Jeremiah the prophet." This is referring to ancient Babylon. The land of the Chaldeans is ancient Babylon. This is not a future prophecy. Verse 2 says, "Declare ye among the nations, and publish, and set up a standard. Publish and conceal not. Say, Babylon is taken. Bel is confounded. Merodach is broken in pieces. Her idols are confounded. Her images are broken in pieces." Verse 2 is talking about Babylon being taken. Who's taking Babylon? Let's get the answer in verse 3. "For out of the north there cometh up a nation against her, which shall make her land desolate, and none shall dwell therein. They shall remove, they shall depart, both man and beast." All three of these scriptures are talking about ancient Babylon. First of all, it mentions the land of the Chaldeans, like I just talked about. And those were the people living in ancient Babylon. In the next two verses, you can see that it's talking about Babylon being taken and then the north country coming up against her. So who is this north country that Jeremiah is talking about? Because remember, if we're talking about ancient Babylon, this is going to have to be a nation that has already come up against Babylon and destroyed them. Well, lucky for us, in Jeremiah 51, it actually tells us who this north country is. Let's read about that north country. Jeremiah 51 and verse 1. It says, "Thus saith Yahuwah, Behold, I will raise up against Babylon and against them that dwell in the midst of them that rise up against me a destroying wind." And here, the Most High is bringing up a nation against Babylon. Let's skip down to verse 11. "Make bright the arrows, gather the shields. Yahuwah hath raised up the spirit of the kings of the Medes, for his device is against Babylon to destroy it, because it is the vengeance of Yahuwah, the vengeance of his temple." So right here, the nation that is coming up against Babylon is the nation of the Medes. This is not some nation that was going to come in the future against some future Babylon. No, this is talking about the ancient Medes coming up against ancient Babylon. And if you look at your history, you can see that actually happened. Let's skip down to verse 28. Prepare against her the nations with the kings of the Medes, the captains thereof, and all the rulers thereof, and all the land of his dominion. So again, it's talking about the Medes, but it's also talking about the nations that are with the kings of the Medes. So the reason why this is important is because really the Medes, they also ruled with the Persians. They kind of combined their nations together, and they basically ruled together. And they teamed up and took over Babylon. So I read all that to say that when we took a look at Jeremiah 50 verse 3, that north country that would come up against Babylon was the Medes. And the Persians also helped them. When you actually take a look at an ancient map of how people think the nations were divided around this time, you can see that the Medes would be actually considered a nation that is north to where Babylon is. When you look in yellow at this map where it says Media, that's north relative to where it says Babylon in green. So you can see how this would be a nation that was going to come from the north. So the first 3 verses in Jeremiah 50 are talking about the Most High sending the Medes against Babylon. And this is not a future prophecy. It's already happened. So verse 4 is going to be continuing that. This is going to be talking about something that's already happened. So let's continue reading at Jeremiah 50 and verse 4, now that we know all that. It says, "In those days and in that time, saith Yahuwah, the children of Israel shall come, they and the children of Judah together, going and weeping. They shall go and seek Yahuwah their Elohim." This verse says, in those days and in that time. So what are those days and what's that time that this is talking about? We already know it. These are the days when the Medes and Persians would destroy Babylon and Israel would be delivered out of their captivity. And look how it mentions Judah and Israel. It mentions both of those nations. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, but I really went through all of these scriptures in Jeremiah 50 and all those other scriptures we went to outside of Jeremiah 50 to show you this. Verse 5, it says, "They shall ask the way to Zion with their faces thitherward, saying, Come and let us join ourselves to Yahuwah in a perpetual covenant that shall not be forgotten." So this, all of what we were reading was to look at this. After this Babylonian captivity, Israel is going to want to join Yahuwah in a perpetual covenant. And this should remind you of what we read in Jeremiah 32, where it mentioned an everlasting covenant. When you actually look at the word everlasting in Jeremiah 32 and the word perpetual in Jeremiah 50 in Hebrew, they're actually the same word. The Hebrew word is olam, and the Hebrew number is H5769. They have the same meaning. They're saying the same thing. But what you may be wondering is, how could they make an everlasting covenant with the Most High after this Babylonian captivity? I thought an everlasting or perpetual covenant could only be something that could be created in the future. Well, that mindset is actually wrong, and it doesn't align with the scriptures. Let me show you why. We're going to go to Isaiah 24:5 first. Isaiah 24 verse 5. It says, "The earth is also defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant." So right here, it's talking about people breaking the laws, and it's associating that with them breaking the everlasting covenant. And this is something that it says they've already done this in the past. So really, when you take a look at the old covenant, or what people call the old covenant, that could be considered an everlasting covenant. And there's even laws within that old covenant that are called an everlasting covenant. So let's take a look at that. We're going to go to Leviticus 24 and verse 7. It says, "And thou shalt put frankincense upon each row, that it may be on the bread for a memorial, even an offering made by fire unto Yahuwah." So in Leviticus 24, it's talking about some laws for the priest. And notice what it says in verse 8. "Every Sabbath he shall set it in order before Yahuwah continually, being taken from the children of Israel by an everlasting covenant." So the Most High calls laws within the Old Testament an everlasting covenant. So this isn't anything that's going to have to take place in the future. This is something that can already happen. An everlasting covenant has already existed according to the Most High's word. And again, when you take a look at this word everlasting in Hebrew, it's that same word that we saw before, olam, the Hebrew 5769. According to the scriptures, like I said before, an everlasting covenant doesn't have to take place in the future. So with that in mind, it's clear that these everlasting covenants and perpetual covenants that Jeremiah was talking about actually took place right after the Babylonian captivity. And you can tell that Jeremiah 31, that prophecy, it aligns with the prophecy in Jeremiah 32 and the prophecy in Jeremiah 50. All those are talking about some covenant that the Most High would make with his people. And since two of those are talking about those covenants being made right after the Babylonian captivity, as in Jeremiah 32 and Jeremiah 50, that means Jeremiah 31 is also talking about this everlasting covenant being made when Israel comes out of the Babylonian captivity. And one thing I want to clear up is something that I've talked about. Remember how it was like, in Jeremiah 50 verse 4 to look at how it mentions Judah and Israel. Well, now we're actually going to take a look at that. And we're going to basically talk about what that actually means. So let's read that again. We're going to go to Jeremiah 50 and verse 4. It says, "In those days and in that time, saith Yahuwah, the children of Israel shall come, they and the children of Judah together, going and weeping. They shall go and seek Yahuwah their Elohim." So we know the context of this is talking about after the Babylonian captivity. But it says Israel and Judah are going to be coming out of that. So if Israel and Judah are coming out of that Babylonian captivity, then that would mean that they actually both went into the Babylonian captivity. And that's pretty interesting because most people think that only Judah went into the Babylonian captivity. But what I want to connect that to is the new covenant in Jeremiah 31. Let's take a look at who it was for. Let's read it again. Jeremiah 31 verse 31. "Behold, the days come, saith Yahuwah, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." So this new covenant was for the house of Israel and for the house of Judah. And this aligns with what everything we read, in Jeremiah 50. It's for Israel and Judah. And I want to give you a little bit of background information on these two nations, just in case you don't already know it. The house of Judah and the house of Israel, they were once the same nation known as Israel. But eventually they split into two nations. Now it's commonly taught that only Judah went into the Babylonian captivity, like I just said. But according to these scriptures, Judah and Israel were actually delivered from the Babylonian captivity. So that would mean that Judah and Israel both went into the Babylonian captivity. How is that possible? Well, here's how. Even after the Assyrians took the house of Israel captive, a remnant of them were able to be in their land after that Assyrian captivity. And we can actually see that in the scriptures. Let's read it. Let's prove that that is actually a true statement. That after the Assyrians took Israel as captives, you still saw them in the land. We're going to go to 2 Chronicles chapter 30 and verse 1. It says, and Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah and wrote letters also to Ephraim and Manasseh that they should come to the house of Yahuwah at Jerusalem to keep the Passover unto Yahuwah, Elohim of Israel. Right here, this is referring to Hezekiah, and in his reign, that was actually after the Assyrians came in and destroyed Israel and took them as captives. But you still see Israel being mentioned here. Notice how it doesn't only say Judah, but it says Israel and Judah. And it also mentions different tribes within the house of Israel, like Ephraim and Manasseh. He's trying to get them to come and keep the Passover unto Yahuwah. So that scripture alone lets you know that there is a remnant of Israel still in their land. And we're going to see that again in verse 6. So the post went with the letters from the king and his princes throughout all Israel and Judah. So there it is again, Israel and Judah. And according to the commandment of the king, saying, ye children of Israel, turn again unto Yahuwah Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, and he will return the remnant of you that are escaped out of the hand of the kings of Assyria. In verse 6, it's clear that there was a remnant of Israel in their land that escaped from the Assyrian captivity. Let's go down to verse 10. So the post passed from city to city through the country of Ephraim and Manasseh, even unto Zebulun. So you have Zebulun thrown in there as well. It says, but they laughed them to scorn and mocked them. Nevertheless, divers of Asher and Manasseh and of Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. In verse 11, some of the house of Israel did come to Jerusalem to keep the Passover with Judah. So if someone tries to tell you that a remnant of Israel hasn't gone back to their land after the Assyrian captivity, that is actually false. Because Hezekiah's reign was after the Assyrians took the house of Israel as captives. But you still see a remnant of the house of Israel in their land. And also, I want to bring up this point. You even see a remnant of the house of Israel not living just in their land in the northern kingdom in Israel, but they were actually living in the land of Judah. We're going to go to 2 Chronicles 31 and verse 6. It says, and concerning the children of Israel and Judah that dwelt in the cities of Judah, they also brought the tithe of oxen and sheep and the tithe of the holy things which were consecrated unto Yahuwah their Elohim, and laid them by heaps. In here, Israel and Judah dwelt in the cities of Judah. Not only did Judah dwell in their land, but Israel dwelt in the land of Judah as well. So there were some Israelites in the land of Judah. So why is that important? Well, at the time when the Babylonians took Judah captive, that means that they could have taken some of Israel as captives because they were living in Judah as well. So when Babylon comes against Judah, they could take Israel and Judah into that Babylonian captivity. So that's one way you could have Israel and Judah coming out of that Babylonian captivity. Also, something to keep in mind is that the house of Israel was also scattered by the Assyrians. And so when Babylon, which would be the dominant nation, took over Assyria at a certain time, then they could have taken Israel as captives when they destroyed those other nations. So there are actually two ways that the house of Israel was in that Babylonian captivity. One was that Israel lived in the land of Judah. The house of Israel lived in the land of Judah. So when the Babylonians came and took over Judah, they could have took some of the house of Israel. Also, they could have taken the house of Israel as captives when they took over Assyria. So those are the two ways that could have happened. So when you actually take a look at the Bible, it actually does make sense now that the house of Israel and the house of Judah are coming out of that Babylonian captivity. So let's just kind of get a summary of this fulfillment of the new covenant. According to Jeremiah chapter 50, Israel and Judah were able to return back to their land. And after they did that, they actually wanted to join Yahuwah in an everlasting covenant. It says a perpetual covenant, but it also means it's the same word as everlasting that we see in Jeremiah 32. And so Jeremiah 32, Jeremiah 50, Jeremiah 31 are all talking about a covenant that the Most High's people will want to make with Yahuwah. And they're all centered around the deliverance from the Babylonian captivity. So this new covenant prophecy in Jeremiah 31, it's actually not something that is going to happen in the future. It's not something that actually was supposed to be fulfilled in the New Testament, because it was already fulfilled after the Babylonian captivity. And we're going to look at the rest of those takeaways to actually see that that is the case. So we're going to take a look at that second takeaway that we saw in Jeremiah 31. And it was that Yahuwah would put his law in his people's inward parts and write it in their hearts. So the question that we need to answer is this talking about a future time when the Most High would do this, or was this already fulfilled? Like how we read that the new covenant was already fulfilled. Well, I don't know if you already caught this, but we actually read about this fulfillment in Jeremiah 32. And let's read that one more time. Jeremiah 32 and verse 39. It says, "And I'll give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever, for the good of them and of their children after them." Yahuwah is saying that he's going to give his people one heart so that they can fear him. And if you're given a heart to fear Yahuwah, you are given a heart to keep his law. Throughout the Old Testament, there are scriptures that associate fearing with keeping the commandments. So when you fear Yahuwah, you are keeping his commandments. And let's take a look at an example of that in Deuteronomy chapter 6. We're going to go to verse 2. "That thou mayest fear Yahuwah thy Elohim, to keep all his statutes and his commandments, which I command thee, thou and thy son and thy son's son, all the days of thy life, and that thy days may be prolonged." In verse 2, it's connecting fearing Yahuwah with keeping his commandments, keeping his law. Because when you fear the Most High, you're not going to be breaking his law. So Jeremiah 32 verse 39, it's aligning with the Jeremiah 31 prophecy. Meaning that this part of the new covenant prophecy was fulfilled right after the Babylonian captivity. Because we already know that Jeremiah 32 is talking about right after the Babylonian captivity. So Yahuwah is going to give his people one heart that they may fear him forever. And let's keep reading in Jeremiah 32. We're going to go to verse 40. It says, "And I will make an everlasting covenant with them, that I will not turn away from them to do them good. But I will put my fear in their hearts, that they shall not depart from me." So the Most High is going to cause them to fear him. He's going to put his fear in their hearts. They are going to be keeping the law. They're going to have the law in their hearts. So right now we're actually going to go to a scripture that describes someone who has the law in their heart. And we're going to go to Psalms 37 and verse 30. It says, "The mouth of the righteous speaketh wisdom, and his tongue talketh of judgment. The law of his Elohim is in his heart. None of his steps shall slide." In Psalms 37, it's talking about the righteous having the law of the Most High in their heart. And according to the Old Testament, how are you righteous? Let's go to Deuteronomy 6 and verse 25. It says, "And it shall be our righteousness if we observe to do all these commandments before Yahuwah our Elohim, as he hath commanded us." So you are righteous when you keep the commandments of Yahuwah. When you have the law of the Most High in your heart, you are actually righteous and keeping the commandments. So when we take a look at Jeremiah 31, where it's talking about the Most High putting the law in your heart and in your inward parts, all that is saying is that the Most High gave his people a heart to keep the law after the Babylonian captivity. So we're going to keep confirming that Israel was actually having the laws put in their hearts after this Babylonian captivity. And this doesn't mean that they didn't have to keep the laws. This is actually talking about them actually being able to keep the laws. We're going to go to Jeremiah 24 and verse 5. "Thus saith Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel, like these good figs, so I acknowledge them that are carried away captive of Judah, whom I have sent out of this place into the land of the Chaldeans for their good. For I will set mine eyes upon them for good, and I will bring them again to this land, and I will build them and not pull them down, and I will plant them and not pluck them up." Israel will go into captivity, and the Most High will deliver them from that Babylonian captivity. Verse 7, "And I will give them an heart to know me, that I am Yahuwah, and they shall be my people, and I will be their Elohim, for they shall return unto me with their whole heart." The people who returned from that Babylonian captivity were given an heart to know the Most High. And with this heart that he would give them, they would be able to return unto Yahuwah. And it says, return unto Yahuwah with their whole heart. So, what does it mean to return unto Yahuwah with your whole heart? Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 1. It says, "And it shall come to pass when all these things are come upon thee, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before thee, and thou shalt call them to mind among all the nations whither Yahuwah thy Elohim hath driven thee, and shalt return unto Yahuwah thy Elohim, and shalt obey his voice according to all that I command thee this day, thou and thy children, with all thine heart and with all thy soul, that then Yahuwah the Elohim will turn thy captivity and have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all the nations whither Yahuwah thy Elohim hath scattered thee." So these scriptures really connect to a few scriptures that we went over about how Israel was going into captivity and then coming out. But I want to just focus on the fact that it equates returning to Yahuwah with keeping his commandments and obeying his voice. Because in verse 2 it says, return unto Yahuwah, which all thine heart and with all thy soul. And it connects that to obeying Yahuwah and keeping his commandments. So really, the phrase return to Yahuwah with all your heart means that you're actually going to keep the law with all your heart. So this heart that Yahuwah was going to give Israel so that they could know him would actually be so that they could keep his laws. And I want to bring out a few more scriptures to keep proving this point. But we're actually going to skip down, or we're going to go back to Deuteronomy 30 and skip down to verse 6. And we're going to see something pretty interesting here, because in these scriptures where it's talking about Yahuwah putting the laws in your heart, putting them in your inward parts, it's pretty much saying that he's going to change you and he's going to give you a mind to keep his commandments. And when you actually look at Deuteronomy 30 verse 6, it actually says the same thing. Let's read that. And Yahuwah thy Elohim will circumcise thine heart and the heart of thy seed, to love Yahuwah thy Elohim with all thine heart and with all thy soul, that thou mayest live. So Deuteronomy 30 verse 6 is talking about circumcising your heart. That is actually changing your heart to love Yahuwah thy Elohim with all thine heart. So he's going to change your heart so that you can love him. That's what it's talking about in verse 6. Well, what does it mean to love the Most High? We're going to go to Joshua chapter 22, and we're going to take a look at verse 5. But take diligent heed to do the commandments and the law, which Moses, the servant of Yahuwah, charged you, to love Yahuwah your Elohim, and to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, and to cleave unto him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. In this verse, it actually says that if you love the Most High, you will keep his commandments. But if you don't love the Most High, and this is the flip side of it, then you won't keep his commandments. So in Deuteronomy chapter 6, really, when it's talking about circumcising your heart to love Yahuwah your Elohim, that is actually allowing you to obey Yahuwah and keep his law when he circumcises your heart. So all this is talking about just changing you so that you will keep the law. After the Babylonian captivity, the Most High would give Israel a heart to fear him and return unto him. We saw that in a few scriptures. And all this is talking about is that he would give them a heart to actually keep his law. And this is what it means in Jeremiah 31 to have the law written in your hearts and placed in your inward parts. And remember, we read that the righteous keep the law. In Psalms 37 says that the righteous have the law in their heart. This means that if you're keeping the law, then the law is in your heart. So inside of the Jeremiah 31 prophecy, at verse 33, it says, at the end of it, that the Most High would be their Elohim, and they shall be his people. And there are clear connections to this prophecy that we've actually already read about. And they're in Jeremiah 24 and Jeremiah 32. So let's start in Jeremiah 24 and verse 7. And we already know the context of this. We read this multiple times. So this is referring to the ancient Babylonian captivity. Let's skip down to verse 7. It says, and I will give them an heart to know me, that I am Yahuwah, and they shall be my people, and I will be their Elohim, for they shall return unto me with their whole heart. So after the Babylonian captivity, Yahuwah uses that exact phrase again, and they shall be my people, and I will be their Elohim. It's the same thing. Now we're going to go into Jeremiah chapter 32. This is something we already read. And let's go to verse 38. And they shall be my people, and I will be their Elohim. In Jeremiah 24 and in Jeremiah 32, those are both referring to the ancient Babylonian captivity. When you take a look at those, the context of those scriptures. So that would mean that, again, this Jeremiah 31 prophecy is being fulfilled right after the Babylonian captivity. This is not something that is happening in the future. So now we're looking at the fourth takeaway, which was that everyone would know about the Most High. And let's get a reminder on this from Jeremiah 31. Let's go to verse 34. It says, and they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know Yahuwah, for they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith Yahuwah. for I will forgive their iniquity and I will remember their sin no more. To a lot of us, this seems to definitely be talking about a future prophecy. But like the other scriptures in this passage, in this Jeremiah 31 prophecy, it's actually not referring to a future time. It's referring to the ancient Babylonian captivity, or right after that. But if it's not talking about a future prophecy, how does it relate to the deliverance of Israel from the ancient Babylonian captivity? That's something we need to answer. We're actually going to see how in Isaiah 45. Isaiah 45 verse 1 says, "Thus saith Yahuwah to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut." Let's skip down to verse 4. "For Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel mine elect, I have even called thee by thy name," talking about Cyrus. "I have surnamed thee, though thou hast not known me. I am Yahuwah, and there is none else. There is no Elohim beside me. I girded thee, though thou hast not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none beside me. I am Yahuwah, and there is none else." So let's break this down. In this prophecy in Isaiah 45, the Most High mentions Cyrus. And Cyrus was one of the individuals who actually rose up against Babylon and destroyed them. The Most High used him to do this. As you can see in verse 4, he called him by his name. Now Yahuwah, he allowed Cyrus to destroy Babylon for Israel's sake. And when you take a look at verse 5, you can tell that the Most High only wants you to serve him. He doesn't want you to serve any other God. He says there's no other God except for him. But in verse 6, the Most High says he wants people to know that there's no other God except for him, and that he is Yahuwah. He alone should be served. But what I want to emphasize is that when it says they in this scripture, it tells you who the they is. When it says from the rising of the sun and from the west, that's talking about all over the world. He's actually, when Cyrus actually comes up and destroys Babylon, he's going to be ruling over all these nations. He's going to be the top nation. And Yahuwah actually used this so that all the world would know who he is. Because it says from the rising of the sun and from the west, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west. That's all over the world. And guess who all over the world includes? This includes Israel. And they are actually the ones being delivered from this captivity. Yahuwah, again, he used the situation to allow the world to know him. And let's get some proof of this. And we're going to see this, and we're going to see the proof of this in Cyrus's decree. Let's go to 2 Chronicles 36. We're going to go to verse 22. "Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of Yahuwah spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, Yahuwah stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth hath Yahuwah, Elohim of heaven, given me, and he hath charged me to build him an house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? Yahuwah his Elohim be with him, and let him go up." Let's say you were a servant or a slave your whole life, and you were at the bottom of the most powerful nation at the time. Then another nation just came up and destroyed the people that had you as a slave or a servant. After that, the ruler of that nation came up and said that Yahuwah gave him all the kingdoms of the earth, and also you who were at the bottom of the most powerful nation society were the Most High's people, and you need to go and build a temple to Yahuwah. If that actually happened to you, would you not know who Yahuwah was? You probably would. And this is how Cyrus was actually used to cause all nations, which included Israel, to know him. And when I say to know him, I'm saying to know Yahuwah. Basically, Cyrus made this decree, and it says he made this decree throughout all his kingdom. And he's saying all the kingdoms of the earth, Yahuwah gave them to him. And he's telling Israel that they are the Most High's people. And he's saying that Yahuwah, his Elohim, be with you guys. Because you're the Most High's people and you need to go up and build a temple to Yahuwah. When the most powerful leader tells you that, you're going to know about Yahuwah. And we're just going to go to one more scripture to seal the deal on this. And we already read this before. Jeremiah 24. And we're going to take a look at verse 5. And we already read this. It says, "Thus saith Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel, like these good figs, so will I acknowledge them that are carried away captive of Judah, whom I have sent out of this place into the land of the Chaldeans for their good." So this is talking about the ancient Babylonian captivity again. Let's skip down to verse 7. "And I will give them an heart to know me, that I am Yahuwah, and they shall be my people, and I will be their Elohim, for they shall return unto me with their whole heart." So Yahuwah says that after that Babylonian captivity, he was going to give his people a heart to know him, that he is Yahuwah. So that is basically the same thing that we read in Jeremiah 31. The Most High was going to cause his people to know him. And that's what this scripture is saying. He's going to give his people in heart to know him, that he is Yahuwah. So after the deliverance from the Babylonian captivity, Cyrus was actually used to allow the people of the world to know Yahuwah, and that included Israel. And really, when you have the most powerful leader come out and say that you need to go back to your land and build a temple to the Most High, you're going to know who Yahuwah is. Okay? And this aligns with what we saw in Jeremiah 31. Really, Jeremiah 31, Isaiah 45, and Jeremiah 24 are all talking about the Most High allowing his people to know him. And we know that Isaiah 45 is talking about the Most High allowing everyone to know about him, but that obviously includes Israel. So what we're going to talk about now is the fifth and final takeaway. And that was the Most High was going to forgive his people's iniquity, and it says he was going to remember their sin no more. So let's see how that was fulfilled. And this is in the book of Jeremiah. A lot of the fulfillments that we've been reading have been in the book of Jeremiah. So we're going to go to the book of Jeremiah, verse 33. Let's take a look at verse 4. "For thus saith Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel, concerning the houses of this city, and concerning the houses of the king of Judah, which are thrown down by the mounts and by the sword. They come to fight with the Chaldeans, but it has filled them with the dead bodies of men, whom I have slain in my anger and in my fury, for all whose wickedness I have hid my face from this city." Once again, this is talking about ancient Babylon. This is in a future prophecy. Now, later on in these next couple of scriptures, it's going to start talking about Israel's deliverance from the ancient Babylonian captivity. Let's go to verse 6. "Behold, I will bring it health and cure, and I will cure them, and will reveal unto them the abundance of peace and truth. And I will cause the captivity of Judah and the captivity of Israel to return, and will build them as at the first." So right here it's talking about Israel and Judah once again coming out of the Babylonian captivity. So we already know why it's saying that. And when you see it says the captivity is returning, right here it's just meaning that the Most High's people are being brought out of their captivity. Now let's go to verse 8. It says, "And I will cleanse them from all their iniquity whereby they have sinned against me, and I will pardon all their iniquities whereby they have sinned, and whereby they have transgressed against me." So the Most High is saying that he will forgive Israel's past sins after the captivity. This does not say if they sin again that he's just going to allow it and not punish them. Okay? So this clearly says that he's going to cleanse them from all their iniquity and pardon their iniquities. So he's going to forgive them of their sins. Now, just to get more clarity, I want to read this scripture in the Septuagint. And this is located in Jeremiah 40 and verse 8 in the Septuagint. And as you notice, the chapter is different. I think just the way they divide up the chapters in the Septuagint might be a little different, or not might be, but are different. So we're going to read this in Jeremiah 40 verse 8 in the Septuagint. It says, "And I will cleanse them from all their iniquities whereby they have sinned against me, and will not remember their sins whereby they have sinned against me and revolted from me." In the Septuagint, it talks about the Most High not remembering his people's sins, just like it does in Jeremiah 31. So Jeremiah 33 closely parallels Jeremiah 31 as it talks about the Most High forgiving his people of their sins and not remembering their sins. As we've seen throughout the scriptures, the Jeremiah 31 prophecy was fulfilled in the Old Testament, and it was fulfilled during the time when Israel would come out of the Babylonian captivity. So we're going to take a look at the different takeaways that we got from that Jeremiah 31 prophecy, and let's just kind of recap how it was fulfilled. So number one, the Most High would make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. That's not the same as the covenant that he made with Israel in Egypt. We read how this would work after the Babylonian captivity, that Israel and Judah would be coming out of that. And we saw in Jeremiah chapter 50 how they wanted to make it says in there, a perpetual covenant with the Most High. And in Jeremiah 32, it talks about an everlasting covenant that Israel wanted to make with Yahuwah. And in both of those passages, they're all centered around the deliverance from the Babylonian captivity. And it's not talking about something that would happen in the future. Just because it says an everlasting covenant doesn't mean it has to take place in the future. So the second takeaway was that the Most High would put his law in his people's hearts. And we saw that directly connected to the next chapter in Jeremiah, which is Jeremiah 32 and verses 39 through 40. The Most High says throughout many scriptures that he will basically change the hearts of his people after that Babylonian captivity and will cause them to keep his law. So the third takeaway was that the Most High would be their Elohim and they would be his people. And this connected directly to a few verses that we went over in Jeremiah 24 and Jeremiah 32. The fourth takeaway was that everyone would know about Yahuwah, so you won't have to teach people to know him. And you can clearly see how this could happen as Cyrus made that decree throughout all nations and basically told them that Yahuwah allowed him to take over the most dominant nation at the time, which was Babylon. And then he wanted the Most High's people to go back and build a temple. So if you are Israel at that time, you were at the bottom of the society, you were a servant or a slave, you're going to realize that the person who helped get you out of that captivity told you that you are Israel and that Yahuwah allowed him to help get you out of that captivity. So you're going to realize who Yahuwah is. You're going to know who Yahuwah is after that time. And we saw a few scriptures that basically, talked about the Most High causing his people to know him. The fifth takeaway was that Yahuwah would forgive and forget his people's sins. And we saw that in Jeremiah 33. It was talking about the Babylonian captivity, or after the Babylonian captivity, when the Most High's people would get delivered from that he would, forgive them of their sins and cleanse them of their sins. And we saw in the Septuagint that it says that he would remember their sins no more. So this prophecy was fulfilled in the Old Testament, and it wasn't meant to have a future fulfillment in the New Testament. Specifically, like I've said many times throughout this video, it was fulfilled right after the Babylonian captivity. So once again, the New Testament misused an Old Testament prophecy and applied it out of its context. All parts of the prophecy were talking about the time when Israel would come out of the Babylonian captivity. So why does the New Testament only talk about a fulfillment centered around Jesus when it's clear that the prophecy was fulfilled hundreds of years before the time of the New Testament? Well, that's just because the New Testament consistently takes Old Testament prophecies out of context, and it misuses them to fit its own narrative and not the Most High's word. After seeing all this information, it should be clear that the New Testament is not reliable because it's changing the true meaning and original intent of the Most High's word. All of this is why you should only serve the Most High from the Old Testament. Shalom.